Greetings and welcome back to Intro to Cultural Anthropology with Dr. Angela Montague. Today we will discuss the global economy from an anthropological point of view. Here are some of the key terms that you should be familiar with by the end of this lecture and this week's readings. Today's global economy is a complex network that involves hundreds of thousands of exchanges every day. Money changes hands rapidly and moves around the globe even faster than people do. Check out the website where'sgeorge.com. It's a voluntary website where people can enter the serial number of any bill they have. Then the next time someone enters that bill on the website, it calculates how far the bill has moved since its last check-in. Through this tracking, you can see how quickly physical money changes hands and how far it can travel. In one instance, a single $1 bill traveled over 4,000 miles in just 3 years. Have you ever thought about who else has held the money in your pocket? The modern capitalist global economy affects all of our lives, and through these interactions, we are connected with virtually everyone else on the planet. The chapter opens by asking if you know where your last chocolate bar came from. The cocoa powder that is used to make the world's chocolate comes from the seeds of the cacao plant. Cacao was originally cultivated by the ancient Maya of Central America. The Maya used cacao to make a spicy concoction that was drunk with great fervor by royalty. When the Spanish conquistadors encountered cacao, they quickly saw its economic potential. They took seeds and plants back to Europe in an attempt to start new plantations. Today, most of the world's commercial cacao plantations are found in Africa, where the tropical climate is similar to cacao's original Central American home. The nation of Côte d'Ivoire alone produces 40% of the world's supply of cocoa powder. In other words, odds are much of the chocolate you've eaten comes from Côte d'Ivoire. The chocolate industry is a massive global enterprise, but like any enterprise based on a plant, it has to start with farmers. Someone has to grow the cacao before it can be shipped around the world, transformed into chocolate, and finally consumed. Cacao farmers in Côte d'Ivoire are in high demand due to the high demand for chocolate around the world. Despite this demand, the farmers make very little in profit. Prices paid for the cacao beans by the international market favor Western countries rather than the farmers. In addition, local government officials in Côte d'Ivoire have placed high taxes on cocoa. The local government knows that consumer demand for chocolate is high and that local farmers will meet that demand. Thus, taxing cocoa is an easy and steady revenue stream for the government. As a result of these factors, there is very little money left over for the cacao farmers themselves. In fact, most cacao farmers in Côte d'Ivoire cannot even afford to buy the chocolate bars that are made from the product of their labor. In 2010, the president of Côte d'Ivoire was defeated in a democratic election. However, he refused to leave office and instead began a civil war. This illegitimate president of Côte d'Ivoire was able to fund his military operations from the high taxes he had levied on cocoa. In other words, the money you paid to buy a chocolate bar in some small part went to fund paramilitary troops carrying out a civil war in Côte d'Ivoire. By taking part in the global economy, we are connected to actions all across the world, and sometimes they are actions that we may not particularly like. As we study the global economy, we will look at several specific questions. What is an economy and what is its purpose? What are the roots of today's global economy? What role has colonialism played in forming the modern world economic system? What is the relationship between the nation-state and the corporation in the global economy? What are the dominant organizing principles of the modern world economic system? How does today's global economy link workers with consumers worldwide? And is today's global economic system sustainable? What is an economy and what is its purpose? Before we can continue, let's take a step back and look at what an economy is and what it means. Today, when most of us think about the economy, whether it's national or global, we tend to think about currency. If the economy is strong, then people have lots of money at their disposal. If the economy is weak, people have less money to spend and save. In actuality, an economy is not defined by money. Instead, economies are cultural systems of adaptation to an environment. Repeat, cultural systems of adaptation to an environment. I know that sounds very different from money, and so it can be hard to get your head around, but what do we use our money for. We buy food, we buy clothing, we buy houses or rent apartments or dorm rooms. Food, shelter, and clothing are necessary cultural adaptations to survive in the natural environment. Do you want to go outside in the winter without a coat? Do you want to live without a home when a storm comes through? Today, we use money to purchase food, clothing, and shelter, but humans have employed many different economic systems to attain these same necessary goods. In this section, we will take an anthropological look at economies, rather than a strictly monetary view. All economies involve three key stages: production, distribution, and consumption. Production involves how necessary goods are produced. When talking about production, anthropologists often focus on food production. As such, we will look at different food production strategies, everything from foraging to industrialized agriculture. Distribution involves how produced goods are distributed among the people who need them. For Americans, this is where money becomes involved. We employ a monetary-based distribution system, but there are many forms of distribution, including market exchange or barter, reciprocity, and redistribution. The ways in which a culture handles production and distribution have major impacts on day-to-day life. Do you have to grow your own food? Do you have to travel to a market in the next town? Do you receive goods that are redistributed by your ruler? Consumption, the final stage of an economy, is usually a little more straightforward. You eat the food, you wear the clothes, etc. While this stage is straightforward, it is nonetheless important. If you do not consume the goods, then you cannot survive. Then cultural replication stops, and the system falls apart. Let's look at production, specifically food production, in more detail. Anthropologist Yehudi Cohen has proposed 5 primary strategies that humans have employed to produce food to eat. They include food foraging, or hunting and gathering, pastoralism, which is raising animals, horticulture, which is raising plants, agriculture, which is an intensified version of horticulture, and then industrialized agriculture, the mass production of foodstuffs. Let's look at production, specifically food production, in more detail. Anthropologist Yehudi Cohen has proposed 5 primary strategies that humans have employed to produce food to eat. They include food foraging, or hunting and gathering, pastoralism, which is raising animals, horticulture, which is raising plants, agriculture, which is an intensified version of horticulture, and then industrialized agriculture, the mass production of foodstuffs. Food foraging relies on food naturally available in the environment. Humans evolved within the context of foraging. Now, only a few marginal populations still subsist exclusively by foraging. But it was our subsistence strategy for 99% of the time humans have been on Earth. They hunted for their meat and gathered the plants that they needed. As we saw in the last chapter, the majority of human beings who ever lived on this planet lived as hunter-gatherers. Interestingly, the popular paleo diet is based on this idea that we should only eat what was naturally available to hunter-gatherers 150,000 years ago. However, it fails to note the diversity of diets of foragers. Foraging and hunting and gathering are synonymous terms in anthropology. Food foragers hunt, fish, and gather nuts, fruits, root crops, etc. Today, estimates suggest that there are fewer than 250,000 people still living such a lifestyle. But anthropologists who have studied foraging cultures have disproved 2 long-standing myths about such a lifestyle. It was long held that hunters and gatherers lived rough and difficult lifestyles. The idea was that they were constantly on the verge of starvation and that they spent all of their time in desperate search for food. Anthropologists have found instead that foragers enjoy a great deal of leisure time, even more than some horticulturalists. While foragers certainly can experience food shortages overall, the diversity of their diet and the flexibility to move between different food sources often leads to foragers being healthier than many horticulturalists or even agriculturalists. Another long-standing myth was that all hunting was done by men while all gathering was done by women. Again, anthropologists have found this to simply not be true. Humans have again and again shown a remarkable amount of flexibility when it comes to survival. Some examples of living foraging groups are the Chpt of Botswana and southern Africa, and the Inuit of the Arctic, the Mbuti of Central African Ituri rainforest, and Aboriginal peoples of the Great Australian Desert. Pastoralism involves raising domesticated animals as a primary food source. It is a food-producing strategy based on herding domesticated animals which produce meat and milk. Many different animals have been domesticated by humans, including sheep, goats, cattle, llamas, turkeys, chickens, pigs, and so on. Raising these animals can easily become a full-time occupation, and each animal represents a considerable investment by the community. This is where foragers have some advantage. If you have an unsuccessful hunt, you can go out the next day and try again. But if your pig dies from an illness or is stolen by a neighbor, you have lost everything that you put into that pig, and now your food source is gone. So it is also generally a mixed subsistence strategy, meaning that it often accompanies cultivation or trading relations with food cultivators. On this page, the top image shows cattle herders from the Sudan, and the bottom shows camel herders from Libya. Pastoralists generally move with their herds, and many are nomadic. I work with Tuareg of northern Mali, and historically they were nomadic, moving across the Sahara Desert with their camels, goats, and sheep to find pasturage. Horticulture involves raising domesticated plants through non-intensive means as a primary food source. It is based on crop production without soil preparation, fertilizers, irrigation, or use of draft animals. When we adopt intensive means for raising domesticated plants, it becomes agriculture. Horticulture is simpler and generally produces less food. Common examples of horticulture include swidden or slash-and-burn farming. This style of agriculture typically involves clearing a field of vegetation, allowing that vegetation to dry out, and then burning it before you start planting. The ash provides an effective fertilizer for the field. Another common form of horticulture is household garden plots. Garden plots are typically fertilized by family waste products, and horticultural methods can typically produce enough food for a family, but cannot support a larger population. The image on this page is of swidden farmers in Thailand. Agriculture has the ability to support much larger populations. Agriculture is the cultivation of soils, use of fertilizers, and irrigation. It is an intensive use of land which is permanently cultivated. It's technically defined as the intensive production of domesticated plants. Agricultural intensification can be achieved through many means, including the construction of irrigation systems, building raised fields in swampy territory, building terraces in hilly areas, and the use of intensive fertilization, usually from animal feces, but obviously now a lot of this is chemical. We'll get into that with industrial agriculture. Through those means of intensification, much larger amounts of food can be produced. This is notable for anthropology because typically when we see the origins of agriculture among human cultures, we also see the origins of ranked societies. Quite simply, the invention of agriculture frees many people from the daily labor of food production. With more free time on some people's hands, we tend to see the diversification and stratification of a culture. With the introduction of modern machinery, many cultures have taken intensified agriculture to the level of industrialized agriculture. Industrial agriculture is defined by the introduction of mechanization and the resultant mass production of foodstuffs. While there are more people alive in the United States than ever before, there are also fewer people involved in growing the food we eat than ever before. Increasingly, industrialized agriculture involves the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and genetically modified crops. All three of these have caused considerable controversy, as I'm sure many of you know, and as a result, many Americans are increasingly seeking out organically grown foods. Okay, let's switch now to look at methods of distribution and exchange. Once goods have been produced, they have to be distributed to the people who need them. There are many different ways this can be accomplished. One form of distribution and exchange is reciprocity. The basic concept of reciprocity is that if I do something for you, I expect that you will do something for me in return. The study of reciprocity has been of great importance to anthropology. Many human relationships have been built upon concepts of reciprocity. Kinship relationships, for example, are highly reciprocal. In many cultures, parents expend a great deal of energy to raise their children. They find them food, seek to educate them, and generally prepare them for the world. In return, it is often expected that those children will help to care for their parents in old age. Modern international diplomacy is also essentially an act of reciprocity. Nations offer aid to their neighbors in hopes that their neighbors in turn will offer future assistance. In their study of reciprocity, anthropologists have identified three main types: generalized reciprocity, balanced reciprocity, and negative reciprocity. So, generalized reciprocity reflects exchanges where value is not closely monitored and the timing and value of a reciprocal exchange, i.e., repayment, is left open. Generalized reciprocity is widely used to build and reinforce social networks. If you are generous and offer your friend a ride today, you hope that someday in the future your friend may be able to help you study for an exam, for instance. Balanced reciprocity represents a more formalized and regularized form of reciprocity. The value of the items exchanged is more carefully scrutinized, and reciprocal exchanges are expected in short order. For example, if you buy your friend a drink, you expect that they will buy you a drink later in the evening. Balanced reciprocity involves higher levels of expected return than generalized reciprocity. Reciprocal exchanges are expected, and considerable social penalties can occur if they are not received. Next time your friend buys you a drink, try refusing to buy one for him later in the evening and see what happens. Okay, finally we have negative reciprocity. This involves the idea of attempting to get more than you give in an exchange. In short, you are out for economic benefit and not social benefit. Think of this as that moocher that lives in your dorm who gets rides and free drinks but never gives anything back. Negative reciprocity becomes more common in cultures when economic benefits can be separated from social benefits. Thus, in a monetary economy like ours, if you get your hands on money, it doesn't really matter how you got your hands on it. You can still use it to buy all of the same things. Another form of distribution and exchange is redistribution. Redistribution involves the collection of goods by a central authority, usually a chief or other kind of ruler, even the government, and once collected, these goods are later redistributed back to the people. In modern American politics, the concept of redistribution is linked with an idea of enforced equality, meaning that everyone receives an identical redistribution of goods from the government. This is not the case with the anthropological concept of redistribution. While many central governments have involved themselves in redistribution systems, typically that redistribution does not result in an enforced equality. Rather, friends of the government typically get more while others are left to scrape by. Anthropologists have found that most complex cultures make use of some form of redistribution. Frequently, we find that powerful political or social institutions maintain support through forms of redistribution. Governments offer protection from outsiders for the price of taxes. Religions offer rewards in the next life for tithes in this life, and so on. Our final form of distribution and exchange is market exchange. Markets intrinsically refer to a concept of bringing goods together for the sake of exchange. The earliest markets found among human cultures operated on a barter system. Those individuals involved in the exchange would have to come to an agreement as to the value of a variety of goods. Then a mutually beneficial exchange could be agreed upon. As markets developed, the mediums of exchange for transactions have gradually become more standardized. In many cases, certain universally desirable goods, such as salt, metals, or precious stones, began to be used as a common medium for exchange. The end result of this process is the monetary exchange system used today. It's important to remember, though, that money only has value because we choose to agree that it does. Ultimately, if you are hungry, food is far more valuable than a piece of paper.